The sand was still cool beneath her feet when Maya Chen spread her towel and sat down, because it was not yet noon, and the summer crowds had not yet reached the particular density that made her want to leave. She had brought a book she had been meaning to read for 4 months. She had brought sunscreen and water and nothing else, because this was a day off and she intended to treat it as one. She opened the book on page 1 and read the same paragraph 3 times. The ocean helped anyway. It always did. There was something in the specific quality of its noise, the layered percussion of waves arriving and retreating, that loosened the clinical part of her mind, the part that had been running triage calculations and medication dosages for 72 consecutive hours before she finally drove herself home and slept for 9 hours without dreaming. The ER did not let you go cleanly. It followed you into the car, into the kitchen, into the first half hour of whatever you were doing next. But the ocean was louder than memory, and she was grateful for that. She was on paragraph 4 when she heard it. Not screaming at first, a change in the crowd's ambient sound, that collective intake, the shifting pitch from background noise to something alert and wrong. She marked her page out of habit before she even knew she was standing. The boy was already out of the water by the time she reached the shoreline. 2 men had pulled him in, and they stood over him with the particular helplessness of people who have performed the rescue and do not know what comes after. He was small, 7 at most, and blue-lipped and still in the way that the body goes still when it has stopped its own argument with the world. The crowd formed a loose ring around him. Nobody was touching him. Maya dropped to her knees in the wet sand. She tilted his head back and checked his airway. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. She registered the absence and began compressions, counting them in her head with the automatic rhythm of 1,000 practice runs and 100 real ones. Her weight forward, her arms straight, the heel of her hand finding the correct position without her having to search for it. Someone crouched nearby and she said, without looking up, "Call 911. Tell them unresponsive child, suspected drowning, CPR in progress." She heard the person move away. She kept counting. The crowd was very quiet. A compression cycle and another. She was aware of the wet sand soaking through her shorts and the smell of salt water and the way the sun fell at an angle across the boy's face. And she was also nowhere near any of that. She was only in the count, only in the work, only in the specific and necessary task of the next 30 seconds. He coughed. It was the particular, racking, desperate cough of a body reclaiming itself. And then he was breathing. And then he was crying. And the crowd released a sound like a single, held breath, finally let go. Maya sat back on her heels and watched his color return. A man came through the crowd the way men with authority move. Not roughly, but with the certainty that people step aside for. He was broad-shouldered and still in street clothes, but his bearing was military in a way that had nothing to do with what he was wearing. He lifted the boy and held him, and for just a moment his composure did something that composure rarely does, which was crack. He looked at Maya over the boy's shoulder. "You saved his life," he said. She was brushing sand from her palms. "I'm a nurse," she said, which was the simplest true answer. He looked at her the way people look at something they intend to remember. She picked up her towel. She did not know his name. She did not know that he was General Richard Harmon, or that he had never in his adult life allowed a debt to go unacknowledged, or that 3 weeks from now a letter would arrive that would split her life cleanly into before and after. She went back to her book. She finally got past page 1. The boy was in the water before anyone on the beach fully understood what had happened. One moment he was there, ankle deep in the white foam at the wave's edge, and the next, the ocean simply took him. A single surge that hit sideways, the kind that doesn't announce itself, pulling him under and rolling him hard along the sandy bottom. The witnesses would all describe it the same way afterward. How fast. How completely ordinary the afternoon had been, and then how fast. Maya heard the screaming before she saw anything. A woman's voice, high and ragged, cutting through the ambient noise of the beach the way certain sounds do. Sounds the body recognizes as emergency before the mind has caught up. She was on her feet, with her book still open in the sand behind her. The crowd had already formed the particular shape that crowds form around catastrophe. A rough ring of people pressed close enough to see, but not close enough to act. At the center of it, two men had dragged the boy from the surf and laid him on his back. He was small. His lips had gone the color of a bruise. Maya pushed through without speaking. She dropped to her knees in the wet sand beside him, tilted his head back with two fingers under his chin, and put her ear to his mouth. Nothing, no movement in the chest. She positioned her hands, heel of the right, heel of the left on top, fingers interlaced, and began. 30 compressions. Ratio. Rate. She counted without counting, the way she always did, her hands finding the rhythm the way her hands always found the rhythm, because she had done this in trauma bays and parking lots, and once in a grocery store, and the hands do not forget. Around her, people were talking. Someone was on the phone. Someone was crying. She did not hear any of it with any part of herself that mattered. 2 breaths, then back to compressions. The sand was damp and cold through her knees. Somewhere behind her, a child was asking its mother what the lady was doing. She was aware of the sun on the back of her neck, the sound of the ocean continuing its indifferent work 20 feet away, and the boy's face, which was slack and still and very young. She kept going. There is a particular quality to time during resuscitation that cannot be explained to anyone who hasn't experienced it. A compression and expansion that has nothing to do with clocks. 2 minutes can hollow out into something much larger. The counting becomes its own world. Then he coughed. It was a small sound, almost tentative, as if he wasn't sure he had permission, and then it became something larger and wetter, and his body curled slightly to one side, and he began to cry. Not the reflexive wailing of a frightened child, but something rawer than that, the sound of a body reasserting itself, and Maya sat back on her heels and exhaled one slow, complete breath. The crowd made a sound. Relief has a particular acoustics. She was still on her knees, brushing sand from her palms, when she became aware of the man beside her. He had come through the crowd the way people with authority move through crowds, and he was lowering himself to the sand without caring about his clothes, and he gathered the boy against his chest with both arms and held him. His composure was very nearly intact. Nearly. When he looked up at Maya, his face had the specific expression of someone who has just understood, with full precision, what almost happened. He was tall, broad, somewhere in his mid-50s. He wore civilian clothes, a linen shirt, dark trousers, but he carried himself the way certain men do, with a posture that suggests the clothes are the costume and something else is the real garment. "You saved his life," he said. Maya stood. She brushed more sand from her knees. The ambulance siren was audible now, still a few blocks away. "I'm a nurse," she said. He looked at her for a moment as though the word didn't quite cover it. "What's your name?" she told him. Then the paramedics arrived, and she stepped back, and the crowd began to disperse, and the ocean kept moving, and that, as far as Maya Chen was concerned, was that. The general arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Maya would remember later. Not the day itself, but the fact that she'd almost called in sick. She hadn't slept well. The boy's face kept returning to her in the hour before dawn, not the blue-lipped stillness of the worst moment, but what came after. The way his chest had hitched before the first real breath, that involuntary animal gasp that never got easier to witness no matter how many times you were there for it. She'd made coffee, she didn't drink, and arrived at the hospital 14 minutes early, which was how she ended up at the nurse's station when the man in civilian clothes walked through the main entrance and asked for her by name. She knew who he was before anyone told her. It wasn't the bearing exactly, though that was part of it. The way he moved through the lobby like he was accounting for every exit, and every person between him and where he needed to be. It was something quieter than that. He was a man who had learned to take up exactly the space required, and no more, which was its own kind of discipline, and he was failing at it slightly, which told her something too. He was holding a boy by the hand. The boy was 7, maybe 8. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he was looking at the hospital the way children look at places where serious things happen, with a seriousness borrowed from the adults around him, not yet his own. He was wearing a clean shirt. Someone had made him wear a clean shirt for this. "Ms. Chen," the general said, "not nurse, not ma'am." He'd done his homework. "Maya," she said. He introduced himself. Richard Harmon. He said it the way people say names when they're used to the name doing a great deal of work in a room and are trying, for once, to have it do less. She appreciated that without saying so. The boy's name was Isaac. He looked up at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify, and then she could. He was trying to match her to the story he'd been told. She watched him decide she was smaller than he'd expected. "He wanted to come," Harmon said. There was something careful in the way he said it. The practiced honesty of a man who chose his words in front of his son with intention. She crouched down so she and Isaac were at the same level. The linoleum was cold through the thin fabric of her scrubs. She asked him how he was feeling, and he said fine. And then, after a pause during which he appeared to weigh something seriously, he told her that he'd looked up what CPR stood for, because his dad said she'd done it to him. She told him that was a good thing to look up. He thought about this. "It means you pressed on my chest," he said. "It does." "Did it hurt me?" "You were asleep," she said. "You didn't feel it." He accepted this with the gravity of a child who understands he has been given the version of the truth that is appropriate for him, and who is not yet sure whether to be bothered by that. He looked at his father. His father gave him a small nod that meant something between them she wasn't meant to read. "My dad says you saved my life," Isaac said. She looked at the boy. The clean shirt, the borrowed seriousness, the faint watermark of something he would carry forward into a life he didn't know he'd almost lost. She thought about what to say and said the simplest version of it. "Your life did the hard part," she told him. "I just helped." Harmon was quiet on the walk back to the entrance. At the door, he turned and said he'd be in touch, and something in the way he said it made her believe him in the way you believe weather. She went back to work. She had 4 hours left on her shift and 3 patients who needed her, and she did not think about the general again until the letter arrived. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. Tuesdays were for ordinary things: grocery runs, overdue laundry, the stack of continuing education modules Maya kept promising herself she'd finish. Tuesdays were not for envelopes bearing the seal of the Harmon Veterans Education Foundation, printed on paper so heavy it seemed to carry physical weight in her hands. She read it standing at her kitchen counter, still in her scrubs, a cooling cup of coffee forgotten beside her. The scholarship was full, not partial, not the kind of offer that covered 60% and left you quietly calculating the gap. Full. Tuition, fees, clinical placement costs. Her advanced practice nursing degree, the one she'd been circling for 3 years like a house she couldn't afford to enter, laid open in a single page of formal language, and one small handwritten line at the bottom. She set it down, picked it up again, set it down. The boy's name, she had learned afterward from a bystander who recognized his father, was Caleb, 7 years old. He'd been chasing a wave, and the wave had won briefly. She remembered the particular blue of his lips, the way his small chest had refused to move, until suddenly it did. She remembered the crowd's silence in those 2 minutes, the specific quality of it. Not peaceful, but held. Everyone holding something they couldn't name until the boy coughed it loose, and they could finally breathe again too. She had not thought about the father much afterward. She'd given her information to the paramedics, deflected the questions people always asked in that particular tone, and driven home. She'd showered the salt and sand from her hair and gone to bed early because she had a 6 a.m. shift, and the body does not pause its demands simply because something significant has occurred. Now she thought about him. The way he'd moved through that crowd, not pushing exactly, but with the kind of certainty that parts people without effort. The composure that had held until the moment he had his son in his arms, and then cracked, just slightly, in a way that was somehow more affecting than collapse would have been. He'd asked her name and she'd given it without thinking. She had not thought to ask his. She looked up the Harmon Veterans Education Foundation on her phone. The board chair photograph confirmed what the handwritten initial had already told her. General Richard Harmon, USMC, retired. 3 rows of ribbons in the photograph. A face that had learned to reveal only what it chose to reveal. She drafted 4 different responses over the next 2 days. The first declined, politely, on the grounds that she wasn't comfortable accepting gifts of this magnitude from strangers. The second also declined, slightly less politely. The third began to accept, and then lost its nerve 3 sentences in, and dissolved into something that wasn't quite either. The fourth was 2 paragraphs. The first thanked him formally and accepted the scholarship. The second said only that she was glad his son was well, and that she hoped he would stay that way, and that she hadn't done anything any trained nurse wouldn't have done in the same moment, which was true, though she understood it would not diminish his gratitude and wasn't meant to. She mailed it before she could write a 5th draft. What she could not have known, dropping the envelope into the mailbox outside her building on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee finally hot enough to drink, was that Richard Harmon had read her name in the paramedic report 14 times before he'd picked up the phone to call the foundation director. Then he'd stared at the ceiling of a hotel room in Washington the night after it happened, listening to his son sleep in the next bed, and understood with the complete clarity that only near loss produces exactly what he owed and to whom. A debt that cannot be repaid demands at minimum an attempt. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day that didn't announce itself. Maya had worked a morning shift, stopped for groceries she kept forgetting to buy, and come home to an apartment that smelled like old coffee. She set the bags on the counter and sorted through the mail without thinking. Bill, coupon circular, and then stopped. The return address was a suite number in Arlington, Virginia. The foundation's name was embossed in navy ink, Harmon Veterans Education Initiative. She set the other mail down. Inside was a single type page on letterhead, and beneath it, folded separately, something handwritten. She read the typed page first. The way you eat the plain part of the meal before the thing you actually want. The language was formal. Scholarship terms, disbursement schedule, contact information for an administrator named Patricia Okafor who would walk her through enrollment. The program was fully funded, no repayment clause, no service obligation, just her name in the salutation and a future mapped out in 3 clean paragraphs. She read it twice. Then she unfolded the handwritten note. The penmanship was careful in the way that suggested someone who didn't write by hand often but had decided this required it. The letters leaned slightly right, pressed firm into the paper. My son asked me what a hero looks like. I told him to remember your face. RH*. Maya put the note on the kitchen table and stood very still for a moment. She'd thought about that afternoon on the beach, the way you think about something that happened to someone else. The sequence of events clear, the emotional content somehow distant, like watching footage of your own hands at work. She remembered the sand, the cold of it through her jeans. She remembered the boy's color, the specific grey-blue that she knew without thinking meant the clock had started. She had not been afraid. There wasn't time for it. Fear was a thing that arrived after, usually in the car on the way home, when her hands shook on the steering wheel and she had to sit in the parking garage for a few minutes before she could go inside. She hadn't let herself think about the father much, the way his composure had fractured, just slightly, when he held the boy. The particular quality of his voice when he said, "You saved his life." Not gratitude exactly. Not yet. More like the moment after impact when the body is still registering what happened. She picked up the handwritten note again. The advanced practice degree had been the thing she'd moved around the edges of for 2 years, pricing it out and putting the number away. Taking on extra shifts and doing the math again, and arriving at the same answer. It wasn't impossible. It just required a version of her life she couldn't quite see yet. Fewer hours at the ER, tuition that didn't resolve into credit card debt, some margin she didn't currently have. The letter in her hand was that margin, handed to her by a stranger whose son had swallowed seawater on a Saturday. She should feel something uncomplicated about this. Relief, maybe. Gratitude. She did feel those things. But underneath them was something else, smaller and harder to name. The faint discomfort of receiving something large from someone you'd never intended to be significant to. She hadn't run across the sand because of what it might become. She'd run because there was a child, and she knew what to do. She folded the note back along its original crease. She put it with the typed page and slid both back into the envelope. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the number for Patricia Okafor. It rang twice. "Harmon Veterans Education Initiative," the woman said. "How can I help you?" Maya looked out the window at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "My name is Maya Chen," she said. "I think I have something that belongs to me." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day that had no business changing anything. Maya had worked a double the night before. She was still in her scrubs when she checked the mail, keys in one hand and a gas station coffee in the other, and she almost put the envelope in the recycling pile, with the credit card offers and the pharmaceutical mailers. It was the return address that stopped her. The Harmon Family Foundation, Washington, D.C. She set the coffee on the kitchen counter. She did not open it immediately. She showered first, changed into clean clothes, put water on for tea she would forget to drink. There was no logic to the delay except that she understood, in some wordless way, that whatever was inside that envelope existed in a different category from the rest of her life. And she wasn't ready to let the two touch just yet. When she finally sat down at the kitchen table and opened it, 2 things fell out. The first was a formal letter on foundation letterhead, single-spaced, outlining a scholarship covering the full cost of an advanced practice nursing degree, tuition, fees, clinical placement costs, at the program of her choosing. No service requirement, no publicity clause, no application. Just a name, hers, and a figure that made her read the paragraph 3 times to make sure she had understood it correctly. The second was a note card, small and cream-colored, handwritten in a compressed, deliberate script. "My son asked me what a hero looks like. I told him to remember your face." R.H. Maya put the note card down. She picked it up again. She read both sides, as if there might be something on the back that would explain it better, and there was nothing. She had thought about the boy sometimes, in the weeks since. Not obsessively. She'd responded to enough codes, enough drip-cold emergencies, that individual faces rarely stayed. But this one had. Maybe because of the beach, the way the setting had felt wrong for what was happening. Maybe because of how small he had looked in the man's arms after, his face pressed against his father's shoulder, the general's composure undone by something no rank could armor against. She had not thought about whether any of it would come back to her. That wasn't why she'd run. Now she sat with the letter in her hands and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. It was something closer to disorientation. She had spent 6 years calculating exactly how far her savings would stretch, what programs she could realistically consider, which ones to stop letting herself think about. She had made peace with the arithmetic. The arithmetic had been, she told herself, fine. The letter made the arithmetic irrelevant in a single page. She thought about calling someone, her mother, her friend Diane from the ICU. She picked up her phone and set it back down. Not because she didn't want to share it, but because she needed another minute in which the thing was only hers, unspoken, not yet made real by another person's reaction. Outside the kitchen window, a neighbor's kid was riding a bicycle in slow circles on the sidewalk. The afternoon was unremarkable. Nothing looked different. Maya smoothed the letter flat against the table and read the note card one more time. The handwriting was careful. A man who had written orders, who understood that what you put on paper became the record. She had gone to that beach because she was tired. She had done what she'd been trained to do. She had not imagined walking back to her towel with wet knees and sand in her shoes, that she was also writing something, that the day would keep going after she left it, moving in directions she couldn't see. She folded the letter back along its original crease. She put it in the envelope. She placed the envelope at the center of the table where she would have to look at it. Then she got up and finally poured the tea. The auditorium at Harman University's School of Nursing held 400 seats, and every one of them was filled. Maya stood in the wings, still in her white coat from the morning's clinical rounds, holding the invitation she'd received 3 days ago. She'd read it 4 times and still wasn't certain she'd accepted for the right reasons. The Foundation's annual beneficiary address. 15 minutes. Share your story. The words had sounded simple on paper. Standing here, listening to the rustling of the audience finding their seats, they did not feel simple. She looked down at her hands. No notes. She'd tried writing something twice and thrown it away both times. Whatever she said would have to come from the place where she actually lived, not from the place that knew how to compose sentences for occasions like this one. General Harman was already at the podium, and she could hear his voice through the curtain. Measured, quiet, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that authority doesn't need volume. He was talking about the Foundation's mission, about the gap between military medical care and civilian nursing practice, about the cost of that gap, measured in people rather than dollars. Then he said her name. She walked out into the light. The applause was immediate, and she let it wash over her without performing anything in response to it. She reached the podium and adjusted the microphone and looked out at the room. Faculty, donors, current students, a scattering of veterans in the back rows still carrying themselves the way soldiers carry themselves, even when the uniform is gone. Near the end of the third row, she saw a boy sitting very straight in his chair, wearing a collared shirt that looked like it itched. He was watching her. She had not prepared an opening. She found one anyway. "The morning after I pulled Eli from the water," she said, "I went back to work. Double shift. A man came in with a construction injury, and there was a woman in Bay 4 who was frightened and needed someone to stay with her while we waited for her scan results, and there was paperwork and a resident who needed correcting on a drug calculation. And by 9 in the evening, I had not thought about the beach once." She paused. "That's not a humble thing to say. That's just what nursing is. You move to the next person because the next person is in front of you." She saw a few people in the audience nod. "I didn't save Eli because I was heroic. I saved him because I was trained, and I was present, and I had not yet used up the particular quality of attention that made it possible to act without freezing." She glanced toward the third row. The boy had not looked away. "What General Harman's Foundation gave me wasn't a reward for that day. It was the chance to be more useful on the next one. And the one after that. That's all I've ever wanted." She stepped back from the microphone. The applause came again, longer this time, and she stood inside it with her hands at her sides, not quite knowing what to do with her face. From the wing, she could see Harman watching her with an expression she had come to recognize over the past months, something between professional approval and something less categorizable. She did not look at it directly. When she walked off stage, Eli was waiting. Someone had let him through from the front row, and he was standing in the dim backstage corridor in his itchy collar, holding a piece of paper folded in thirds. He held it out to her. She unfolded it. He had drawn 2 figures in blue crayon. One was in the water. One was kneeling on the sand. Below it, in careful, large letters. That is you. Maya folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her white coat. She did not say anything. Neither did he. They didn't need to. The letter sat on the kitchen table for most of the morning before Maya touched it again. Not because she hadn't read it. She had read it 4 times the night before, standing under the hallway light in her coat, grocery bag still in hand. She set it down now the same way she'd set it down then, carefully, as though it might change if she moved too quickly around it. Outside, fog was coming in off the water. She could hear it in the silence. That particular muffled quality the city got when the bay decided to remind everyone it was there. She made coffee. She stood at the window. She thought about the boy's face. Not the blue of it, or the stillness. She'd seen that part before. Had filed it away in the professional compartment, where you kept the things that could destroy you if you held them too long. She thought about after. The way he'd looked up at her with his father's arms around him, eyes wide and confused, and already beginning to understand that something important had happened, though he couldn't yet name it. The way children absorb the weight of a moment without knowing what to do with the weight. He would carry it differently in 10 years, in 20. She knew that too. The letter said her enrollment deadline was in 3 weeks. She'd worked the night shift the first time she read it. She'd worked the night shift the second time, the third, the fourth. There was always a next shift, which was one of the ways she'd arranged her life, so that the larger questions never had room to fully arrive. 2 years of prerequisites deferred. The program brochure she downloaded and then left in her downloads folder, unopened, for 8 months. The way she'd told herself that the timing wasn't right, that the money wasn't there, that wanting something that much was a kind of arrogance when there were patients who needed her exactly as she was. She picked up the letter. Harmon's handwriting was what she'd have expected from a general. Precise, controlled, slightly larger than necessary, as though he was accustomed to writing things meant to be read from a distance. The note was 4 lines. She'd memorized it without meaning to. She thought about what it meant that a man who commanded thousands of people, who moved through rooms that changed when he entered them, had sat down and written 4 lines by hand. She thought about the Foundation's formal letter underneath it, 2 pages of terms and conditions and disbursement schedules, and how the handwritten note had rendered all of it beside the point. He'd asked his son what a hero looked like. She was not comfortable with that word. Never had been. She knew what she'd done on the beach. She'd done her job in a different location, without the equipment she preferred, with an audience that didn't help. That wasn't heroism. That was training and proximity, and the particular luck of being exactly the right person in exactly the wrong moment. But the boy had been 7, and 7-year-olds needed a word for it, and maybe it didn't matter whether the word fit perfectly, so long as it pointed somewhere worth looking. She set the letter down. She picked up her phone. She navigated to the downloads folder and opened the brochure. It was exactly as she remembered. Curriculum, faculty, clinical placement requirements. A photograph of a hospital corridor that looked like every hospital corridor she'd ever worked in, which was either uninspiring or honest, depending on the morning. She read the first page, then the second. Then she set the phone face down on the table, which was the gesture she used when she'd made a decision and didn't want anything interrupting the 30 seconds it took to become certain. The fog was still coming in. The coffee had gone cool. She picked up the phone again and began to fill out the application.